Okay, so I mistimed the music. Sue me. I can now mix my rhythm claps. Nice one. Well, welcome AC. I know, I mistimed it. I know. How we doing? We doing good? All right, all right. So just brief rundown of how this stream is gonna go. Gonna start with kind of like a breakdown like we've been doing. You know, I'm gonna open up a session that I just mixed recently. We're going to pull apart some things. I'm going to show you a little bit of my thought process behind some things. We'll give you the result. And then we're going to actually switch things up a little bit. And I'm going to start fresh. And we'll mix it up together. How's that sound? Sounds pretty good? Well, why don't we go ahead and get a move on with some things. Let me go ahead and open up Ableton. Yeah. So I'm in Ableton today. I normally daily drive Pro Tools, but I figured that I would kind of do this in Ableton and stock Ableton more accurately, stock Ableton for most of the stuff that I've got, just to kind of show you that you can get a decent mix with just stock plugins. If you know how to use it, if you know the fundamentals and you know the basics, you can get a really good mix and a really solid track with just stock plugins. So why don't we go ahead and take a listen to the track. This track is called Siren by Georgia Wonder. Why don't we just go ahead and take a listen to it before we roll things off? Let me just get a couple things switched around. Yeah, let's just take a listen to it, see what we got. So this is I'm going to add my compression and my master bus effects. This is the final mix that I got. So let's take a listen. just stop it there, because this one is the version that I didn't trim off the end. So, but yeah. So that's the final mix. That's what I finished with. So why don't we go ahead and start tearing things apart? Now, one thing I wanted to note immediately was the kind of like the core fundamentals of this track. So this entire track, how I structured it, the most basic and most present instruments are going to be the drums, the bass, the guitars, and the vocals. Those are the ones that I put as my priority. Those are the ones that I put in the front of my mix. So let's go ahead and start with just the drums and the bass. Why don't we? So we'll go ahead and just take a listen to these two. And you can just hear kind of like the balance between them. And we'll start kind of tearing things apart, how I process things and why I process things the way I did. So I'm going to go ahead and start playing it, and I'll start deactivating stuff as we go. So you can kind of hear how, as I'm stripping away some of the stuff, you can hear how it's losing a lot of its punchiness, it's losing a lot of its bite. It's also losing a lot of the character and tone that I've kind of embedded in some of the more important parts, especially the kick, the snare, and the bass. You can hear some really drastic changes with that, and that's mostly just because I processed it to taste. I didn't necessarily want to have a very like fuzzy bass tone, but constantly listening to just this really clean tone where it's just didn't really suit the song, in my opinion. It didn't really flow very well in terms of the kind of direction that I wanted to go in with this mix. So one of the first things I did was I started shaping all of my stuff. I started shaping my kick, my snare, and my bass with a little bit of EQ work. And generally speaking, I like to start with color. So I'll do more broad bandwidth boosts and cuts, or filter out some frequencies with a more gradual slope. The reason for that is I like to get the tone that I want for the song first, then I'll go back and fix issues later. Especially once I've got my compression, my saturation. You can notice on this bass track, I do come back with a little bit of a dip around 100 hertz, and I'll explain that one when I get to it. But just plain basic, I'm going to load up the EQs that I have on things. These loops, I have just the lows cut out because it was starting to clash with the low end in this, and so I'm going to leave that alone. But simply, I just did that on all three of these. This one didn't really need it. And I'm not going to add something if it doesn't need it. So you can see I've got nothing on this hi-hat, nothing on the cymbal rolls, and nothing on the cymbals entirely. So I'm not going to add stuff if I don't have an issue, if I don't need to change the characteristic of it. That being said, let's start loading up these EQs. So starting with this bass. Already here, I'm bringing back a little bit more of the attack, a little bit more of that pluck every time. So that's what that 800 hertz band is for. Filtering out the low end, just making sure I don't have any loose sub end, and then just dipping out a little bit of that 100 hertz again. Uh, starts to build up, at least in this track, it starts to build up there really easily, and so I started immediately with that just to kind of shape that low end. Let's go ahead and load up the kick. So immediately with just the EQ, you can hear a massive difference from before and after. It starts to get a little bit more punchy, a little bit more lively, and I really like that tone, and it, in my opinion, really suits this mix. And so moving on from that, now I'm going to start shaping it in terms of compression, saturation, just to kind of get the tone that I want out of stuff, and then I'll blend things together with that. So with this bass, since this was one of my, again, I'm emphasizing on the drums and the bass because these are my key kind of components in this mix. Starting with this bass, I like to go, I wanted to go a little bit and tame down a lot of the attack that I brought out of it, just to kind of get some control over the dynamics of this bass. Bringing in that compressor really adds a level of control, and it also helps support the low end, especially in the space. Then I'm going to bring it up with a little bit of OTT and a little bit of saturation. These kind of work hand in hand in the way that I have things set up. I'm adding a lot of fuzz with this OTT, and then I'm kind of adding onto it with this saturator. This OTT, while there is a kind of OTT version in Ableton, I started with this one because I knew immediately how to get my tone. This version is a free plugin that you can get. So before any mixing, you want to know what the main components of the song is. Yes, so when listening to a song, and it'll become really obvious when I kind of pull things back and do a fresh start, you'll kind of see how I want to shape things. I want to identify what my key components are. I want to identify kind of like my 3-tier cake. If you listen to anything, whenever I give like feedback to people, you'll hear me talk about adding a level of importance to a song. And that's mainly identifying what are the most important elements of your track. Is it going to be the drums, the bass, and the vocal? Is there something else that you want there that's important to developing this song, to developing the character that you want to go for? That second tier is going to be those supporting elements, and that second tier is going to support the first tier. And then the third tier is going to be other stuff that's kind of below all of that, but that supports the tier above it. So all of it kind of makes one large support for that very most important layer. That's kind of the way I view mixing. That's kind of the way that I approach a mix, is I want to have my most important be the most important, and everything supports that. So adding in this color, just to kind of get a little bit more tone out of this, to add a little bit of saturation and high ends to this bass, I'm going to bring it in and take it out, and you can hear what each element is doing as well. So before and after, really just makes it sound less of a DI, more of like you're plugging it into an amp. Really adds that flavor that I really like, mostly because My style, I come from a lot of metal mixing and stuff like that. And so while I'm electronically trained, I do work in metal a lot. And so I like to get really distorted tones and stuff like that to really drive elements. And so with adding that saturation layer, I noticed that there was a small buildup around 100 hertz. And so I'm just kind of scooping that back down, making sure that my harmonics are not overpowering my fundamental. And if I pulled it up in span, I could probably show you, which I've got over here. So go ahead and take a listen to the bass tone, and I'll kind of plug it in and unplug um, the bass. Let me actually get one that you'd be able to see a little bit more clearly. So you can see the right when it gets to that lower note, that lower fundamental, the harmonic kind of overpowers it. And so I'm gonna go in, kind of EQ it down a little bit just to kind of tame it a little bit more. It'll still kind of overpower it, mostly because of the way that things are shaped here, but it's doing it enough to where you don't really notice it. And so I'm gonna go ahead and play it. And so with that EQ, you can see that it puts a little bit more emphasis on the fundamental rather than the harmonic. That's just kind of cleaning things up in a way. Um, but yeah, we'll move into the drums now, and I'll go ahead and pull that up because I do a lot of fun stuff with the drums. So we'll go ahead and take a listen to the drums entirely. And I just wanted to point out right now, while I've got a chance, if you've got any questions at all during this entire thing, go ahead and put it in the chat. I've got it pulled up right next to me. I will read it and I will make a note of it. I'll answer your questions. Um, but right now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be starting to add back in elements. I'm going to enable it, disable it, enable it, and then move on to the next one. That way you can kind of hear how things start to build up. And then the reasoning for that will become a little bit clear the more you listen to it. So moving on to the snare. So this one kind of is probably a little bit of a confusing thing as to why I added this kind of reverb to my snare. And the reason for that was I was kind of going for a little bit of a larger sound than what I was getting out of these drums initially. Um, I also wanted to kind of soften it at the same time a little bit more and add a little bit more emphasis on some of the snares on the bottom. And so adding this reverb a little bit kind of killed two birds in one stone in a way. Yeah, exactly. It adds a little bit of like a little bit more bite, especially in that high end, and kind of gives it a tone that I'm looking for. Gets it a little bit larger, a little bit more spacious, and it doesn't take up so much transient information because that's one of the things that while I haven't gotten to it yet, um, that's one of the things that was one of the difficulties in this mix was that there was a lot of transient information. You'll kind of see that more as we get to the guitars, the acoustic and the electric guitars, as well as the sitar. You'll notice a little bit more of that transient buildup because a lot of things are strumming all at once. And so just wanted to start by taming it where I could and added this reverb to again get a little bit more life out of this snare. With that, I also sent it out to a couple of returns as well. I have a drum room here, and I also have a little bit of color, and I'll go ahead and play it with and without that. Um, Mostly, what this is doing is it's just adding a little bit more of a space for it to sit in. You know, adding a little bit of a room for this drum set kind of made it sound a little bit more like it was real, like it was playing with the rest of the band and not just samples. And so I definitely wanted to play around with that, trying to get it a little bit more, also larger than life as well. And so I'll go ahead and enable it and I'll let you take a listen to the before and after with it. So you can hear now that I've added these rooms, these tones to the rest of the kit. You can hear how a lot of it just starts to become alive almost in this mix so far from what we've heard. But yeah, so basically what I'm doing here, to start with this drum color one, because this is something that I don't often do, but I usually do it when I need to get a little bit of softer cymbals, or if I want to more accentuate or transform the cymbals into a tone that I'm looking for. In this case, I was kind of going for adding a little bit of warmth to it, but also giving it a little bit more sizzle on the top. And so mostly what I sent here was the cymbals, a little bit of the hi-hat, a little bit of my snare, and a little bit of my drums overall. The reason why I'm focusing more on the cymbals is you can kind of hear it when I enable it and disable it. It just adds a little bit more brightness to it. It adds a little bit more color, and almost gives it a sense of space in this mix. All right. And then this drum room is kind of a little bit self-explanatory. I'm basically sending my entire kit to a reverb, and then shaping that, compressing it, adding a little bit of control to it. You can see kind of, I do this weird thing with this utility. That's because when I'm bringing it in to a reverb, it can come in a little bit quiet. Pro Tools makes it a little bit easier. I don't have to go with a utility boost, shape it, and then utility cut it. But yeah, I had to kind of do a little workaround since I don't normally drive Ableton. So with that though, you can hear it before and after. It adds a lot more color again. It also gives a little bit more context for that snare to sit in, because without it, that snare being so reverberant has no reason being there. And so I'm kind of giving a little bit more context as well. That's kind of more of like um, a byproduct rather than an intentional thing, though. So with that, though, you can kind of hear a little bit of how the drums and the bass came along. I'm going to go ahead and enable just this multi-band on the bass, though. This is basically just something I added at the very end because I was starting to get a buildup around in the low end. I was just getting a lot of overwhelming bass when I played this in my car, and I'm just like, okay, I need to tame that a little bit more. And so that's basically what that's just doing. It's just taming that low end and that mid range a bit more, just to kind of get some more control over it. But this is what it sounds like, and this is also the drums without the kind of bus processing that I have on it. So I'll play it, and then I'll enable this bus processing, and I'll explain kind of why I did the things that I did with it. So with this drum bus processing, what I've got going on is I've got a little bit of kind of a more advanced look of EQing. I'm doing a little bit of mid-side EQ on this. You can see I'm emphasizing a couple fundamental frequencies, shaping my low end in this mid band, which is basically my center channel. And then in the sides, I'm ducking out a little bit of the boxiness, the muddiness that I'm getting from it, and then emphasizing a little bit more of the high end in the sides channels. Adds a little bit more brightness in the sides, gives it a little bit more context and a little bit more overall width to the kit with it. And yeah, I honestly think that this EQ right here kind of finalizes my drum processing on this, because it adds a lot of control and a lot of character with the frequencies that I'm boosting and cutting, especially because I'm operating this in mid side, which is basically my mid channel, my mono channel, and my sides, which is my far left, far right. Just got here. What if if anyone can summarize that? Basically, played through this track. Started tearing apart my drums and my bass. That's really all I did so far. You haven't missed too much. A lot of the good stuff is still to come, but yeah. Glad to have you though. Yeah. So moving on from my drum and bass, moving on from that, since that's my key fundamental, I'm going to move into my next key, which is my guitars. So I'm going to play it with the bass and the drums, just so that you have context for things. When we start tearing things apart, I will do them in solo. But one thing I recommend when doing a mix is generally working outside of solo. The reason for that is you want to have context with what you're doing, what you're changing, and stuff like that. So we'll go ahead and take a listen to this. Let me just pull up a quick blurb with some guitars. Yeah, all right. So with that, you can kind of hear this track take on a sense of self, a sense of direction. Um, and as I was playing it, if you had been looking at my screen, you would see that I'm not really doing a whole lot of processing on the guitars, on the acoustic guitars, on the electric guitars. I'm basically just doing a lot of bus processing on these. The reason for that is I wasn't hearing any like fundamental issues with any specific one of them. And so with them all kind of acting as a whole, I didn't want to like heavily EQ one because they're all playing different parts. I didn't want to EQ one out and then another one differently because then you lose a lot of continuity. You're losing a lot of that fullness. What is bus processing? That's actually a great question. Honestly, great question. I think I did overlook that earlier. So, um, bus processing is basically when you feed your individual channels to solo specific channel. Uh, and excuse me, I'm just trying to find the right words as I'm talking. So, what you're basically doing is you're routing all of these channels to one single channel where you're doing a lot of your summing. What is mid-side processing? I'll open that up in a little bit more because that's more advanced stuff. Didn't think I'd be having to explain mid-side processing, but since I am kind of breaking down stuff, might as well explain it as well. Yeah, so bus processing is basically just taking all of the heavy lifting, not necessarily all the heavy lifting, but adding processing to the sum of all these channels. So right now, you can kind of see, if I pull up these guitars, I have all of these guitars routed to this group right here. And you can see kind of, if I open it up like this, you can kind of see a little bit more clearly what I mean. All of these tracks are routed to this track right here, where I'm adding a little bit of processing on stuff. So mid-side I'll get into in a little bit when I pull up the processing on these guitars, because I do a lot of manipulation in my side channels to make sure I have enough space for my other elements in this mix. That being said, bus processing at its most basic is just, yeah, bus processing is the processing on the track. So yeah, otherwise it would just be kind of like the subgroup or the bus group, which is just where all of the summing takes place. And then you can adjust everything on a single fader rather than having to adjust this guitar, this guitar, this guitar, this guitar, and this guitar all at the same time at the same level. You could just adjust this one. Makes it a little bit easier when working with large amounts of tracks, like I'm working with here. The whole total of like what I think 68 tracks. I think no, I think it's like 64. Anyways, yeah, it's a form of abstraction in a way. Anyways, moving into what I'm doing with these guitars. If I play this section out, you can kind of hear what I'm doing with the processing when I disable it and then enable it. So I'll go ahead and play this section out. So massive change with this. And you can see I also didn't change this EQ. This was just because I tried something, it didn't work, and rather than deleting it, uh, the way that I work is kind of like I'll leave evidence of I tried this. That way, if I come back to it the next day, I don't try that again and realize that it doesn't work. Let's see, we've got a couple questions here. So in this instance, the bus processing is the multiband and transient processor, and that multiband is a compressor. Yes. Yes, it is. So what I'm doing here with this multiband is when I disabled it, you can kind of hear some notes ring out more resonant than others. And so what I'm doing with this multiband is I'm basically kind of clamping down on those resonances, making sure everything is just nice and thick in terms of tone. Thick with 3 C's, basically. So that's smart? Yeah, that's pretty smart. But basically, when I play out some of these notes, you can hear how it's more resonant. And this multiband compressor basically just clamps down on those, controls the dynamics for me. Thick, yeah. And it basically does a lot of the heavy lifting for me. And with that, I'm very appreciative of multiband compression. And for those of you that don't know, multiband compression is basically compression, but you can control the frequencies that each compressor is focusing on. So it's basically compression that's focused in bands of frequencies. So it'll focus on like your low end. So anything from like 20 hertz to how I have it set here to 359 hertz. That's one compressor. From 359 to 2.5 kilohertz, that is another compressor, and then 2.5 and above is another compressor. It's a third compressor. Gives you a little bit more control over dynamics, a little bit more control over tones as well. Helps with controlling resonances, but it also helps with controlling muddiness as well. I'll do a lot of multiband compression on vocals, mostly to tame the lower mids, the body of the voice, that way that it doesn't become too present in the mix, because it kind of gets in the way of the guitars, the bass, the drums. So having a lot of low mid presence in vocals, depending on the vocal that you're working with, because some definitely need just control in that area. It's just a very loose area, and so by adding that multiband compressor, you're basically adding a level of control to it, and working with that. So, and then Potato Tot also noticed that I have a transient shaper on here. The reason for that is because as I'm listening to this mix in full, I'll go ahead and play it in full, just everything for this one part, and I'll disable this transient shaper in the dynamics, and you can hear what problems I'm fixing with it. This group processing was more of during the middle of my mix, I noticed a big issue, and so this is a lot of fixing right here. So I'll go ahead and play the entire track. You're not the only soul I've seen. Take off my limiter so that you can hear my most of my processing, just so you can hear the difference, because it doesn't quite come across with that processing on it. So this is it again with it off, and then I'll put it back on. You're not the only soul I've seen. very subtle issue, but what I'm mostly hearing, if I take out my synths, if I take out my strings, if I take out the acoustic guitars, what I'm mostly hearing is a lot of um, yeah, uh, basically you can hear a lot more of the transient than I want you to hear.
You're not the only soul I've saved. Come to help me to love you. Come to help me to love you.
So Potato Tot, actually, no. In the way that I'm using this transient shaper, I haven't opened it up for a specific reason, because one thing that we tend to think of with transient shaping is accentuating transients. What I'm actually doing is I'm clamping it down. Now, the reason why I'm using a transient shaper rather than a compressor is because when messing around with the compression, I wasn't getting fast enough results. All of my really fast compressors are in Pro Tools in AAX format, not in VST. And so I'm utilizing a transient shaper to really grab those initial transients. Um, and the reason for that is there's a lot of buildup in terms of transients. I've got guitars, I've got acoustic guitars, I've got bass, I've got synths that are adding a little bit of pluckiness, I've got vocals that are coming in and out. Controlling the transients on this one thing solved a lot of problems, especially when trying to finish the mix. So I'll go ahead and play it without the transient shaper, but and without the multiband compression, just so you can hear the transients and focus on the initial kind of strums.
You're not the only soul I've saved. Come to help me to love you. Come to help me to love you.
So you can hear I'm really clamping down on it. I'm really just minimizing the amount of transient buildup, which would create a lot of issues when adding my compression and my limiting, especially when I'm trying to finalize this mix and master it. Yeah, can't really pick out each individual. Just sounds kind of muddy. Exactly. That's an issue that I kind of glance over in this terms, in this case, because what these guitars are basically doing to this mix is it's just adding a lot of color. So if I play it back again, you can hear um, it's just adding tone, transient, but also a little bit more body to it. And that's the color that it's adding. It's a little bit of body. So I didn't really focus on EQing it out much, especially because that bus was also within another group. And I'm doing a little bit of EQ work here and a compression work here. And so with that, um, I didn't really need to focus on EQing my individual guitar channels, mostly because, again, a lot of this is just adding direction, adding character, and these guitars, while they are the main body of it, it's the entirety of the guitars and the entirety of the acoustic guitars that are the important keys in my mix. And so by focusing a lot of the processing power on the broad spectrum of them, I can really shape the tone that I'm trying to get out of them in the mix. rather than trying to go channel by channel, solving issues with every single one. So you can see none of these guitars have any processing outside of the groups that they're in. This one has a little bit, just because, and I'll play it with and without. But yeah, very barren in terms of EQ work. Little unrelated, but whenever this mix is done, can you go ahead and send me this song? What I can do is I can actually just send you the mix result that I have, because this song is actually a released song by Georgia Wonder. I have the multi-tracks for it so that I can kind of work with it. But this song is a song that came out back in like I believe 2011. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's got a different mix entirely. But since you really like this, I'll go ahead and share with you my mix of it. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm working with here. A lot of the tracks that I work on, yeah, a lot of the tracks that I work on are either copyrighted or uh, are in process of working, like in progress, and are going to be copyrighted stuff. And so I was trying to find something that's YouTube friendly, and I stumbled across this track, and I was able to get the multi-tracks on it. But yeah, since this stream is going to go on YouTube, I figured I might as well play to YouTube's standards and not make YouTube angry with aggressive copyrighted metal. So, massive thumbs up. But it was also because I'm trying to find a song that could maybe more relate to the people in the AC community, a little bit more than metal can. Because the way that metal is mixed is a lot different than electronic. Um, in terms of what's the most important things and how you process things. Genre really plays a big role in that. And so I was trying to find something more electronic oriented that could maybe assist you guys with your mix. Massive big brain move by Kay. Exactly. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and play everything else out now. Let me go ahead and bring back in my bass, my synths, and everything. Let me just bring back everything.
You're not the only soul I've saved. Help me to love you. Help me to love you.
So, whenever I was referring to these guitars as my key, I specified acoustic and electric rather than just grouping them in their own guitars. The reason is because they serve different purposes in this mix. The electric guitars serve a more melodic direction. The acoustics, however, exactly. So, in a way, I'm kind of taking the acoustics as more of a second important, a second tier, working in conjunction with the electrics that are adding the melodics, that are adding melody to it, and then bringing that into. So I'm bringing the acoustics to support the electric, basically, while also maintaining a level of importance in their own right. The acoustic seems like more of a background element, exactly. Mostly because it's just strumming the entire time, and so. But there's also some strumming on the electric as well, you know. So there's that. All right. But yeah, you can see here again, like I said with the electrics, I'm not really doing a lot of individual processing. In fact, I'm doing none on any of these. All of it is just the bus processing that I have on the guitars. And you can hear the before and after if I isolate that down with my drums and my bass. So now we're going to start talking a little bit about mid-side EQ. I'm not going to get into the full rabbit hole because I could be here for hours explaining all of the possibilities, all of like what you can do with it. So I'm just going to kind of explain things in a little bit more of a simpler way. So what I'll do is I will actually grab, excuse me. Let me go ahead and grab my vocal. No. Let me just grab a guitar. It'll be a little bit easier. So just going to make sure that I have what I need to explain this. Perfect. I do. Awesome. So let's talk about mid-side processing and stuff like that. Now, when I'm talking about mid-side processing, I'm basically explaining the stereo width of something. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up wider and ozone. The reason why I'm pulling up ozone is for this element right here, this vector scope, this imager. And we'll focus on this electric guitar mostly because of what I've done with it. So without the wider, you can kind of take a look at what this is explaining. So I just need to make sure my mouse is visible. Perfect. So the mid channel is basically everything in this center channel and maybe going a little bit left, a little bit right to these kind of lines right here. These lines are your hard left and hard right. Now you'll also see a little bit more in this left channel and this right channel going to full 180 degrees. These two little pies is your side channels. So if I play this guitar right now, let me actually grab a utility not wider. That'll make it a little bit easier for me to show you the difference. So I'm going to put it directly in mono. And I'm also going to kind of clamp down on the width of it. A lot of my information is in my mid channel. Now if I grab my width and I bring it all the way to the sides, those are your side channels. If you're listening on headphones, great. If not, I would recommend picking up a pair of headphones. Yeah. I'm not necessarily trying to go into true mid-side mode. I'm just trying to kind of explain with audio right now. But Toboto, you make a great point. Again, I'm not an Ableton driver. I drive Pro Tools. And so I just kind of came in here to do a stock mix to show you guys. Because Ableton's a little bit more... easy to get into, right? It also works a little bit with Oxy. And so it makes it easier for you guys to get into it as well because you can take your projects from Oxy directly import it into Ableton. And it's a lot cheaper to get into Ableton as well if you want to go like full out. I don't remember how much it costs, but I believe it's like around $200. to get a full license for their production lineup, whereas Pro Tools uh, is like 2,000 or so. So that's why I'm in Ableton today. We got a question. What's the difference between the mid, left, and right channels, and why do they sound the way they do? So the mid, the left, and the right channels is basically just the overall panning of things. And so if I take this utility just to demonstrate, this is your mid channel again. It's mono, straight down the center. Hard left follows this inside line. Hard right follows the other inside line. The width comes from the side channels, which is kind of going beyond that line. And this is kind of just to differentiate what the mid and side channels are. There is a technical explanation. Do I know it? No. I just know how to manipulate it. Jesus, Pro Tools is expensive. Right? Exactly. But yeah, so that difference is basically what I'm manipulating in terms of operating this EQ in mid side. So before, it sounded like this. So when I enabled that back in, you can kind of hear a little bit more of your side channels kind of kick in a little bit. You know, before it's very much like a hard left and right. After, I'm adding a little bit more brightness in your side channels, a little bit more depth for this track. So we'll play it before and after again. So the best way that I can describe what this EQ is doing, other than the, the obvious shaping of pulling out my boxy frequencies, shaping my low end out, making sure I don't have any sub information that I don't need, and emphasizing a little bit more of my higher mids, both in my mid and my side channels. The reason, the best way I can describe what this EQ is basically doing, without getting into the technicalities of why I'm deciding to dip out some of the side informations and accentuate some of the other ones, and dip out different frequencies in the mid channel, is it basically takes this guitar from sounding like it's coming directly at you from a speaker to sounding like it's in front of you in a room, in the same room that you're in. And that's really the best way I can describe it, is it basically just changes where that guitar is coming at you from. What does boxy mean when I say boxy frequencies? Okay, that's a great question as well. So let me go ahead and pull up a different EQ. Excuse me one second. Allergy season is not pleasant for me. So let me go ahead and pull up a EQ for you. Now, boxy frequencies are generally describing a kind of cardboard-esque tone to things, and generally resides around here in terms of most elements in a mix. And so without this, kind of makes it sound like it's in a box. Hence boxy. You kind of get into a little bit of nasally territory around 500 to 800. So I'm going to emphasize a little bit more of, like, let's say 600. The reason why I refer to this as the nasally area is because that's the sound that gets emphasized when you plug your nose. You get a lot of more buildup in that frequency because it takes a lot more of it just condenses your voice. And so that's what it sounds like when you plug your nose. You get a lot more of that nasally area. Some vocalists have more emphasis in this area, so you have to really tune an EQ to the vocalist, and I'll explain a little bit more of that when I start breaking down my vocal chain on this. But that's basically a rundown of the term boxy and nasally. Muddy is not really present in this guitar, but muddy is generally right around 120 to 240, depending on the instrument. Sometimes it can be up to 400. Sometimes it could be as low as 110. So it really depends on the instrument, but that generally describes your muddy frequencies. It is just a buildup in those frequency ranges, that very low mid area. So with that, that kind of sums up the guitars in a little bit. But basically, what I'm doing here with the acoustic guitars to kind of put them in the back. Of course, I'm not playing. Before, I always assumed that muddy meant that there's just a lot of frequencies in the same place. So when there's a lot of frequencies that are happening in the same place, you get a buildup. Not all buildups are issues, though. However, some can be more present than others. One thing that you might run into when you have multiple frequencies in the same band is you might run into an instance of masking, which is basically one element that has that frequency band is more present than the other elements that have that share that same band. Masking basically can really affect your drum tone, your bass tone, but also if you have a vocalist, masking can come into play in kind of getting in the way of those core elements of your mix. And so, yeah, it's just mainly something to be mindful of. And always, again, listen in context and listen to things before and after. Take it out, take it in. One thing that I like to do if I make like an EQ change, and I'm not sure if it's the right change, is I'll pull it. We'll focus on this electric guitar track. I'll basically pull it in and out while closing my eyes. So with it out, this is what it sounds like. And then one way that you can really know if you made a good decision in terms of your EQ is kind of like cycle through it and then like take yourself out of the equation, take your eyes out of the equation. If you focus on just the sound and you listen closely for which one you prefer, and then you open your eyes and see whether or not your EQ is on. So I prefer this one because, and I've got my eyes closed still. I prefer this one because there's a little bit more emphasis on the mid range and less emphasis in the low mids. Whereas before, I was kind of getting a little bit of a boxy tone out of it, and I was kind of just overall getting a tone that I didn't quite like. And I realized that my EQ was on, so obviously I made a good choice then. You can kind of really hear, if you really pay attention to that lower mid frequency, the difference between the two versions of this EQ in and out. Moving on though, that way we don't spend the entire stream on just the guitars. All right, I have a little bit of strings here and some synths. Now, those are going to be the instruments that I'm going to get into next, mostly because I want to save these vocals for a little bit later. The reason why is because there's a lot to unpack. So let's go ahead and put some emphasis on my synths and my strings. So I've got this string section that comes in every so often, plays a little blurb, something like this. That's not even enabled because I'm still in solo. Look at me go. I'll go ahead and just solo these out though. So I've got a string section that just kind of comes in, adds a little bit of a lift. And so with that, I do a little bit of processing in parallel. Yeah, parallel. So this is my dry. I did not name these at all. And this is my parallel signal. So basically what I'm doing here, really basically, is I'm taking out the low end information with this 3 EQ blend. Basically just automatically applies a filter if I disable this low end, this low band. And then I just set my frequency to where I want it to be, set my slope, which is 24 decibels per octave and 48 decibels per octave. What that basically is, if I pull up FabFilter, is it basically determines the shape of it. So this is what a 24 band decibel per octave slope would look like, and then a 48 is a lot sharper. You've got also 6, which is more gradual. I'll generally use 6 if I'm just trying to kind of de-emphasize the low end of something, but I don't necessarily want to get rid of it. Same with 12. Then you've got like up to 72, 96. This is in FabFilter Pro Q3. And then you've got Brick Wall. I'm not a huge fan of Brick Wall because it introduces a lot of phasing issues. And so the highest I'll generally go is up to 72 in linear phase mode with high setting. This is the most that I'll generally do in terms of filtering. With that being said, I'm doing a little bit of parallel processing, which is something that we get to unpack now. What are phasing issues? Okay. So in general, I want to see if I've actually got a I do not have it in Ableton. Okay, so basically in terms of phase, every element has a particular phase. So if I really zoom in on this bass track, you can see here, this is the phase of the bass. I have a positive spike and a negative spike. This 0 kind of point in the middle, that's my zero crossing. That's where the speaker is basically at a standstill. So the best way I could describe this, without getting too technical, is to think of it as like a speaker. So a speaker moves in and out really quickly to reproduce sound waves. So basically what this is telling me is that the speaker is going to dip down a little bit, then spike out, then dip back in, spike down, spike out, dip down, spike back down, spike out. And so it'll be positive, negative, positive, negative. And that's just basically the air pressure. Phasing issues comes when you have it kind of happening twice. Not that button. Meant to go like this. So you'll run into phasing issues when, let's say that this was flipped 180 degrees out of phase. So it would basically look something like that. When you've got a dip and a spike going at the same time, and I'm trying to kind of dumb this down as much as possible. When you've got these kind of going in opposite directions, they basically just cancel it out they cancel each other out if they are, you know, the same amplitude. And so, very simply, what I can do to kind of illustrate my points, I don't know if I have actually. Actually, yeah, I can make it really quickly. Um, just really quick, kind of sidetrack here. Let me create a track where I'm just gonna have um, just a oscillator on. So I'm simply just gonna have this oscillating. Let me make sure. All right. So phasing issues basically comes into play. Not that button. Comes into play when you run into two sources. So both of these right now are in phase. If I play a note, now if I flip this one out of phase, if I grab a utility and I flip the phase of it, now you hear nothing. And that's because at the same amplitude, yeah, basically. And you can't quite make a speaker go in and out at the same time. And so it just stays at its zero crossing, which is at its resting point. So right now I'm in phase cancellation. You can see I'm going signal out, but I have nothing on my master. But as soon as I, bring down like the gain on this one, you can hear how it comes in and out, and that's because there's a difference in amplitude. But when the amplitude is the same, the phase is completely 180 degrees out of sync, you get cancellation. And so that's basically a phase in a nutshell. In a quick, just fun nutshell test. So when opening up these strings, one thing that I noticed that I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of add a little bit more airiness. I wanted to kind of open it up a little bit, add some more decay to it, because without this signal, it sounds very bland. Oh, I'm still in keyboard mode. So this is what it sounds like, just dry. Is that a problem for sounds in similar frequency ranges, or is that a problem for every sound in a mix? Generally, it would be a mixture of both. If you've got a frequency that's being that's causing issues, or a frequency that's out of phase within two elements, you can get some cancellation at that frequency, and you can get a little bit of like a almost like an EQ in a way. It'll completely suck out that frequency. So one thing you want to be careful of is making sure that if you've got elements that share frequency or share elements within it, you want to make sure that they're kind of in phase. There's easy ways to figure it out. One easy way is with Span, which is a free plugin. This is basically just a whole kind of full frequency analysis, but it also has some information down here at the bottom if you understand what you're looking for. So you can see here my correlation meter. This is basically telling me my phase response with everything. If I had stuff that's really out of phase, this correlation meter would be closer to -1. But everything that's in phase kind of supports it, and that'll be +1. And so basically what this is looking at is looking at the difference between the right and the left channel. And then if it completely cancels out, not cancels out, if it's just naturally left and naturally right, this will generally show a positive value, either 0.5, 1. Right now, this strings is a little bit unnatural since it was synthesized. And you can see it bounce around a little bit. I'm not really going to get into correlation meters and stuff like that because that's a lot more deeper discussion. And I don't think I really have the time for that in the scope of what I want to do with this full track. But basically what I'm doing with the strings is I'm introducing a reverb on the track in parallel. And this is something that I usually recommend if you want to add effects, but you don't want to kind of like add it fully. You'll see this dry wet knob. I'm not a fan of these dry wet knobs, mostly because it changes what's being played. So when it's at 100% wet, it's playing all of the wet signal and none of the dry signal. When it's at 50% wet, 50% dry, it's playing half of each of those. And so it gets a little bit quieter because your wet signal, depending on what you're doing, your wet signal may be quieter than your dry, or it may be louder. And then your dry is just 100% of the dry, 0% of the wet, and it kind of crossfades like that. So like 25% of the wet and 75% of the dry at 25% dry wet. At 75%, it's flipped, where it's 75% of the wet signal, 25% of the dry signal. So it just changes how much of that signal is actually coming through. This is why I recommend doing things in parallel, where you're basically either sending a copy of the signal to your, for example, your reverb or your saturation. You're sending a copy of that, and then you can blend that back in with your dry signal. That way you're not losing any amplitude. You're not losing its place in the mix, but you're also adding that dimension, that character that you wanted to get out of it. It's a very powerful tool, especially when you want to do like parallel compression or parallel saturation. In this instance, I'm using it to kind of implement a little bit of parallel reverb on this track. And so you can hear without it, it sounds really dry. If I switch the two, all you get is the wet signal. But when I bring them both in together, you get a blend of both. And this is why I'm a huge fan of parallel processing stuff. And you can see I kind of notate it with 2 slashes. And fun fact, that's why if you look at my like Discord tag or my my Instagram handle, you can see I've got 2 slashes. That's because while I like working in mid-side frequencies, I also like working in parallel. And so I incorporated that a little bit into my brand. Control the amount of effects. Andrew Huang has a great video about it. Exactly. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend trying parallel processing out. If you've never done it before, try it. It's a lot of fun. You can do a lot of quirky things with it. Yeah. And it's a great tool. And I generally do work in parallel with some things, especially when we get to vocals. I don't think I did any parallel processing on the vocals in this mix, but what I'll do in metal mixes is I'll send a parallel signal to an amp sim of my vocalist. That way I get a lot of bite, grit, aggression, and it basically gets that live sound of the vocalist singing into a combo amp, a vocal amp. I did recommend that. I do remember that. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and open up these synths now, which is going to be fun because these synths are actually really fun, really playful in this track, and I really do enjoy them. And to kind of skip ahead a little bit. Skipping ahead a little bit more. And so you may be wondering, Kay, in this entire mix, where were the synths in this track? And here's a very simple answer for you. Why don't we just go ahead and hear the difference with and without the synths and what they're basically doing and the way that I have them set up in this mix. So let me just make sure I got everything enabled. So yeah, nailed it 100% of the way. They're supporting the guitars, which is my key element. My synths being my second tier instrument. They're supporting it. They're giving it more warmth. It supports the acoustic, gives some airiness. All great descriptions. Nailed it 100%. You can really hear that it adds a lot more movement as well, especially in this section, where without it, it's very bland, very dry. And then you can definitely hear it during this more isolated part later on. So yeah, it's you guys are actually nailing it. It's not the main element, but it's adding support to those main elements that I previously noted out. Exactly. It helps support it. It supports the entire track. Without it, it's just a bland mess of guitars and drums and bass and vocals. But yeah, so breaking down what I'm doing with these synths, this is going to be a little bit fun because I'm doing a little bit of fun movement kind of manipulation in terms of how I'm processing them. And I'm also doing some individual processing on some of them as well. Actually, just this one really is what I'm adding it on. Don't know why I have it duplicated here, actually. That's a really good thing that I didn't realize. It was duplicated. But yeah, so basically what I'm doing with these synths, playing it in solo, we'll go ahead and grab a loop right here. Just kind of play back and forth some things. But let's go ahead and take a listen to what I'm doing on the bus of everything. So you can hear while I'm taking it in and out, I'm getting a lot more movement when things are enabled. Well, when when it's disabled, it's very static. Now, I already kind of added a lot of dimension and depth in the way that I panned my elements. So you can see here I've got some panning on some of these synths. If I take off the panning, it's a very static, very bland, I like to say, a bland, steaming pile of poo. But it's not terrible. But let's just hear what the panning introduces. So without the panning, there's a lot of emphasis on the center channel. A lot of it. And with every other element in this mix that's also taking up that mid channel, where is the synth gonna go? So let's introduce a little bit of panning on some elements. I believe it was. So already just adding in a little bit of panning, you can hear stuff opening up. Exactly. You guys are on top of things. Look at you. Absolutely nailing it 100% of the way through. I'm just going to bring back the panning that I had originally. That's all I'm going to do. Makes the mix not as cluttered. Yeah, exactly. It gives sounds room, has its own pocket to it. Panning gives each sound its own little spot. Exactly. Yeah, you guys are nailing it 100%. And then let's go ahead and get into what I'm doing with the processing on the bus. You know? Very briefly though, this is just because of this synth right here is very meh without this. It was too attacky, too much transient for me. Especially remember with the guitars, I'm trying to tame it a little bit. So I just put a reverb on it, full wet. Adds more like a pad in a way. That's just a very brief thing that I wanted to open up. But yeah, let's hear what I'm doing with the chorus ensemble. If I make this fully wet, so that chorus ensemble that I added is adding that movement that this entire section is lacking. It adds movement over all of the synths, gets things moving around, makes things less static. So it's always finding its own little space to poke out in the mix when everything else is playing. Then we move into this EQ. I'm doing a little bit of, again, I'm filtering out the low end, making sure I don't have any buildup in my low frequencies, giving myself some room with my bass and my drums. Then I'm also emphasizing a lot of my upper mid range on this. You know, I'm really adding a lot more width as well in terms of the side channels being more accentuated. I'm also accentuating at different frequencies from my mid channel and my side channel. That just kind of gets it moving a little bit more. It helps kind of play with the ensemble that I did. So I'm going to keep the ensemble on full wet right now, just so you can hear what this EQ is really accentuating with the ensemble. All right, and now we're just going to bring it back down to where it was at, and I'm going to add my saturation, which is basically just adding color, warmth, a little bit of distortion. Because, again, I work in metal. I like that tone. But yeah, now that I've pulled that apart, you can really hear where things are coming from in terms of that. So moving on from this, we'll go ahead and get into the moments we've all been waiting for, the vocals. I would touch on the sound effects, but I'm literally not doing much with the sound effects. The only processing I have is on one, and that's just to get a little bit more impact, doing a little bit of parallel saturation on the low end. But let's get into the vocals. So I'm doing a little bit of vocal work here. As you can tell, I got a little bit of compression EQ, got a little bit of EQ, compression, back to EQ, a little bit of stereo manipulation, some EQ, compression, back to EQ. Now we're on another bus group, so I'm starting with compressor, then pulling into saturation. And I have an EQ on here. I'm not really doing anything with it. It's just kind of there because I thought I was hearing something and I wasn't. So honestly, I could just get rid of it. It was never there. Some EQ, saturation, compression, opening up my other ones. This one gets really fun because I'm adding a lot more movements. We just watched a murder. Unfortunately, yeah. And then back to some very non-processing. Because I said this earlier in this, if there's not really an issue with something, I'm not going to add stuff to fix it. So let's go ahead and take a listen to these vocals. I'll go ahead and pull up just the lead and the backing. I'll also add in the drums. That way you can kind of get a sense of what's going on.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, selling to my lies. Take my hand.
So actually, M-Star, not really. So M-Star basically said in chat that he thinks that these vocals have already been de-essed before I got them. Not really. What I'm really doing is I'm focusing with my EQ. You can focus if I pull up my lead vocals. If I open these up, you can see right here. This is my de-esser right here. I didn't really want to pull up a de-esser plugin because I'm not missing a lot of these frequencies. Same here, a little bit of de-essing. If I pull up my backing vocals, I'm not really getting much de-essing here. But I kind of am doing a little bit here. Not necessarily focusing on one band. Again, if I'm not hearing any issues, I'm not going to create solutions if there's no issues for it. So let's go ahead and keep listening to these vocals.
Have no choice. I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep. Who needs to breathe the air above when we're both drowning in my love? The tides have turned, don't be afraid. You're not the only soul I've saved. Come to me, help me to love you. Come to me, help me to love you. Come to me, help me to love you. Come to me, help me to love you.
So you can kind of hear those vocals come in and out a little bit rough, but I wasn't really running into any issues when playing back in the full mix, in the full spectrum of things. Now, the reason why I constantly say mix with context is because the reason why those vocals sound rough and I didn't change them, other than this one, you can see I changed this one. I didn't change them because they're not really adding any issues.
Only soul I've saved.
Again, like I've said numerous times, if there's not an issue with something, there's not really any necessary need to go and fix it. You know? Now, I'm doing this mix for myself and for you guys. If this was for a client and they were asking for stems, I would spend the time to go in there and clean things up, clean up the starts of things. I would zoom in, especially on like these backing tracks, and maybe just start like every time they come in to maybe bring out a little bit of like a slice here. I'm just gonna back that off so I don't get crossfade, and then just kind of tame it a little bit. Exactly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's no need if it's not causing issues. Now, this one was causing issues, and you can kind of see what I mean when I back this off. When it comes in, it's very breathy and very sharp. And that really started to protrude through the mix, especially when I got closer to the end. And so I went in there, found the problem, and fixed it. And now it comes in a little bit less painfully aggressive. That's so far back. And before, I wouldn't necessarily call it a transient. The reason why I wouldn't call it a transient is it's because it's not the start of something. It's brought in with a very quick breath in, but it's very breathy and on the mic. So when I talk about transients, I mostly talk about like mechanical stuff. Stuff like piano strings, guitar strings, bass strings, and drum heads. Stuff like that would induce transients. Vocals don't necessarily have transient unless you're talking about like stuff like that. But when it's a breath, it gets very breathy, that can kind of act in a way similar to a transient, but it's not necessarily transient in itself. It's just very breathy. So that's really why I'm very specific with the words that I choose, is because one thing could mean many things in terms of audio. And so when we're specific about things, we can specifically understand how to treat things, especially if we respect the basis and understand the basis of what it is. And so if I'm treating vocals and there's a lot of bite, a lot of attack out of this breathy start, go in there, shape it a little bit with a fade, or maybe take out the breaths a little bit, attenuate them. Pro Tools has this amazing clip gain function where I can literally go in and change the value of the actual file, like here, before it reaches any processing on the strip of the channel. So, like, for instance, I would be able to attenuate like this part right here of this vocal down a little bit before it even reaches this EQ. And this is why I daily drive Pro Tools, is because of that functionality where I can literally manipulate the audio file even at the very file itself all the way through to the end. So while it's expensive as fuck, it's also powerful as fuck, and this is why I daily drive it. But Ableton has some really great tools in terms of that. How I would kind of fix it in Ableton is how I did it here, where I just cut it to the point where I want to, and then bring in a nice gradual fade on top of it to to kind of clamp down on that breathy attack of the vocal. All right. But yeah, so when talking about vocal processing, one thing that's really important to understand is that everyone sings differently. Everyone has different ranges. People have different tones in their voice, different overtones, different harmonics. And so you really need to be careful with your EQ to make sure you're not kind of squashing, to not take out the important parts of that voice that make it unique, that make it sound how it is. So let's start with my lead vocals and my lead doubles. Starting here.
Just give in, there's no getting away from.
I'll go ahead and actually, while I've got a second, I'll go ahead and take out the reverbs and delays of it. That way you can really understand what's going on.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night.
I'm going to go ahead and disable all of these and all bus processing as well. I'll move the saturator out of the way just so I can just do this.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my light.
Now we'll start opening up the vocal in terms of how I've processed it. So starting with the EQ on both of these, again, I like to start with my color EQ, get the tone that I want. first before I do any changes surgically, where I'm taking a lot sharper bands in terms of bandwidth rather than more general broadband stuff. So adding the color, again, filtering out anything that I don't need, keeping room for my bass and my kicks, and eliminating any sub or low end rumble that's in the voice or in the recording. So with the EQ,
Just give in, there's no getting away from me.
let me go ahead and just solo this lead vocal. Just the solo it.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect.
In this case, surgical would be the de-essing. However, in terms of surgical, it would be more necessarily like, is there an issue with this frequency? Yeah, there is? Okay, so I'll take this and I'll start attenuating that frequency until I don't hear the issue anymore, or the issue is not as present. So, in terms of surgical EQ, what I'm basically doing is I'm taking a sharp, narrow band and just kind of taming any issues with it. So, if there's a buildup of frequencies, that would qualify for surgical. If there's a sharp frequency, that would qualify for surgical. If there's a resonant frequency, that would probably be more multi-band compression, but in a way, that would be surgical. The way that my mentor taught me was color is, what shade or what hue do you want? Do you want this to be blue? Do you want it to be purple? And then surgical is the eraser. If you color outside of the lines, you erase it so that it fits within the lines. If you add too much, you can take away some. That's kind of the description that they utilized, the analogy that they utilized when I asked them about color and surgical EQ was basically considering it like coloring a coloring book. You add color because you like that color, and then you use your eraser to clean it up. It really is a good analogy. It honestly is. In any case, though, we'll continue moving down the line of this vocal. Now, with vocals nowadays, you'll get a more modern sound the more you compress it. It depends on the genre that I'm working in. With metal, I'll really compress a vocal. With this track, I didn't want to do a metal compressed vocal or a rap compressed vocal. But I did want to tame the dynamics. You can see the dynamics here. With how loud certain sections are and how quiet others are, you can see there's a really loud one right here, really quiet ones right here. And this compressor basically just takes it all and shapes it down and controls the dynamics of it.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my light.
So this compressor is basically keeping that vocal right in front rather than letting it dip into the back, especially during this section right here.
Such a perfect night, sailing to my light.
It's a very subtle effect, what I'm doing with it, but in the full mix, it makes a lot more sense.
Such a perfect night.
Then again, I'm bringing in this EQ. Without this EQ,
Just give in. Just give in. Just give in.
I'm getting a lot less resonance in that S. We'll move into my double. With this one, it's a stereo file, and it's got already some left and right information, and so I'm going to just emphasize it a little bit more move it out of the way of this lead. And then I'm emphasizing it a little bit again with my color EQ in mid side, shaping out my mids, making sure I've got space for my drums and my bass, emphasizing a little bit of my mid frequencies and my high frequencies. And then in the side channels, my upper mids and a little bit of my highs, just a very, very small amount. Then I introduce a compressor again to tame my dynamics, and then I bring in a surgical, which basically lifts everything up a little bit more than what I needed, and then dips down a problem frequency at 9K.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me.
So you can really hear it kind of adds two other voices to this when I enable everything in my chain. When I disable it, it sounds like one voice is being supported. Both have very good reasons and both have very good points. But in this instance, what I wanted was a little bit more of unique character in each of these voices, each of these takes. So without it, it wasn't the direction that I wanted to go in. Both are very valid directions to go in. I would generally recommend a vocal to be more supportive of that lead. However, in this case, I wanted to stray away from it and be a little bit colorful because this entire mix is a little bit flamboyant in my eyes. So without,
just give in, there's no getting away from me.
And with,
such a perfect night, sailing to my lies.
adds a lot more dimension to these vocals, and it really adds it into its own light, takes up space, all of the things that I really wanted it to do. The bus compression that the bus processing that I'm doing on it is a little bit of bus compression, just adding another layer of compression to control the dynamics of it, and a little bit of surgical EQ just to make sure I'm not getting anything out of my in my low end, and also dipping out a little bit of my boxy frequencies.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my lies.
So yeah, you can really hear it come into its own light.
Just give in,
Especially when I bring it into the entire mix.
just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my lies.
So at the beginning of this stream, I had said that I'm going to kind of break down my final mix and then I'm going to start fresh and I'm going to give you guys an insight as to how I get my levels, how I get my rough mix started to where I can start implementing the stuff that I broke down here. Basically, I'll show you how to get decent levels. I'll show you what I'm thinking about in terms of my vocal processing, and I'll get a general rough idea as to where I want to go with my vocals, and with my rough mix. Again, I mix in two phases in a way. I start with a rough mix, and I try to get my rough mix down. Now, it may not be applicable to you because you guys are generally going to be producing your track, and so you're going to be listening to stuff on repeat. But since I do this as a business, I want to make sure I get my rough mix down while I'm still maintaining my objectivity of this mix. And so the first time listening to it, I want to get a rough mix down within the first 3 repeats of the track. That way I don't get too familiar with it. I still have room to play with things. I still have room to hear issues in this mix. Because once I start, over listening to it and getting this mix done, since I don't spend as much time with it, I will start to make decisions that may not benefit the mix in the end. And so yeah, while I'm breaking down things, I'll also build up things later in the stream. So stick around for that. If you need a dip, I believe this is going to be recorded and put on YouTube. I would definitely recommend watching both halves and kind of seeing, like, you know, if you ever get feedback from me saying pull things down and start again, you can kind of get a sense of what I mean by that. But also how to get like a good rough mix for you to, start adding some effects to, start adding your dimension to, and really manipulating the tone that you have. So with that, I'm going to go into my backing vocals, which is a little bit more of a hassle to deal with because it's constantly going. It doesn't really have that, it doesn't have the gaps in between that give the melody a chance to breathe. It's just constantly going with it.
I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep.
So I've got my lower octave in the front here.
I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see.
Oh wait, no, it is actually swapped. I changed the order of them. That's why.
I cross my heart, I tell no lies.
So my first layer, I'm just, again, EQ, saturation to get a little bit more color, a little bit of surgical EQ because I'm running into some issues here, and my compression to get my dynamics under control. Now moving into my other layer, this one gets a little bit more interesting because I'm actually doing some other different things with it. So I'll let you listen to it before and after with this processing.
I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep. Who needs to breathe the air above when we're both drowning in my love? The tides have turned, don't be afraid. You're not the only soul I've saved.
So what I'm basically doing is I'm adding a lot more movement with stuff. So the kind of blueprint that I strayed away from with my EQ, compression, saturation, and surgical EQ, I added my saturation and then a little bit of distortion with this overdrive. So I'm going to cancel out all of these, and then with and without this saturation.
Cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep.
And now I'm running into a little bit of issues with my low mids, so I'll introduce my surgical EQ to kind of tame down those more boomy frequencies, those resonant frequencies that I don't want to get in the way.
When we're both drowning in my love.
And then I did parallel processing yet again on my vocal. I'm introducing a phaser on this. Now, this was more for style. This was more because I really wanted to get my own take on what I could do with these vocals and just play around with a little bit. And so I have my dry signal and then my chain, and my chain basically just sounds like this.
When we're both drowning in my love.
Sounds like it's just got a phaser on it. But incorporating that underneath my dry signal.
When we're both drowning in my love, the tides have turned. Don't be afraid. You're not the only soul.
And you can really hear it without it.
Hear me calling in your sleep.
It just adds a little bit more brightness to me. It adds a little bit more movement. And so I really enjoyed putting that on there. And so I left it there. moving into the chorus vocals, not really doing any individual processing on any of these. Again, I ran into an issue with this one, so I did a little bit of trimming. So this is just more reliant on the bus processing that I have on this, which would be just a little bit of compression and saturation. Again, just to get a little bit of brightness, a little bit of character, color, and tone out of it. Moving into these little whispers almost. This one was fun because it already came with pre-baked panning on the track. And so I really just emphasized that. With this, I just kind of laid things out in a way. Again, really just focusing on bus compression at bus processing at this point because I'm not hearing any issues, anything that needs attenuating or fixing. The only thing that I could possibly think of would be this vocal take right here being really breathy. So if I was to fix that, I generally would just go with an EQ and pull down a little bit of my lower mids. Come to me, come to me, come to me, come to me, come to me. And then my low end as well. Come to me, come to me. But I kind of liked it when it came in and added that really breathiness and got really intimate with the vocal. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and play these as well. These kind of came in on their own times, and so I just kind of wanted to make sure that they all rose to end at the same time as well. All right. Now, this one was really interesting because it adds a lot of tension. And so without these, it kind of just came in a little bit too soon. Come to me, come to me, come to me. And so I just wanted them to all kind of hit the same note at the same time. Almost like, you know, the THX logo, where you've got those detuned synths reaching their chord at the very end and it resonates and it kind of messes with the theater, just rumbles everything. Kind of wanted that same effect here, so I really kind of just emphasized making sure they all hit on the same time. With that being said, though, I'll go ahead and pull this back a little bit more and just let you listen to where we're at in terms of the vocals and what that really accomplishes here. I think I might have something disabled. Nope, okay. The only other thing that I can think about bringing up is this little bit of parallel processing, especially on this section right here. So what this is basically just doing is it's adding a lot more low-end saturation and a lot more rumble in this section. It just adds this impact that's already here. It gives it a little bit more of an explosive note. Oh, excuse me, I accidentally hit my spacebar. It just gives it a little bit more of an explosive nature. And so I'll go ahead and play it in solo so you can hear it before and after. So that's without it, and then with it, it kind of sounds like this. So again, if you're listening on headphones, you probably heard that a lot better than the people that aren't, but it adds a lot more of this low end rumble that just takes this part and really like pulls it away from the entire mix from where we got from what we've got so far. This entire track has been going in one direction, and this impact right here, this little downlifter, almost adds a takeaway, and it changes the entire direction of this track. And so I really wanted to emphasize that, and you can hear it in the final mix if I just play it back here. Without it, it doesn't have that same effect. And so if I play it back, it's a lot weaker. It doesn't have that rumble, that power, that explosiveness that I'm looking for to pull away from this section before it. And that's actually a fun little trick that I picked up while working for a couple of post places and a little bit of film, is utilizing. They utilize a send directly to the sub, and they saturate that send. This kind of plays on that idea in that I'm just saturating the low end. Anything below 120 is getting a lot of saturation right here. And so it kind of gets that same effect that you would get inside of a movie theater when an explosion happens and the entire theater rumbles. It gives that same effect, but in your car, and it doesn't cause any issues with anything because I'm not introducing more phase issues. But yeah, that basically finishes this entire mix breakdown. I've got a little bit of processing on these vocals in terms of reverb. So I've got a hall reverb right here. If I could just open this up properly. I think I was going to add this to a chain, but I ended up not. Or did it disappear? I think it actually poofed. Very confusing stuff. Oh, there we are. No, I just am being a little bit stupid. Again, not a daily Ableton driver. So I'm kind of doing a blend of two different halls to get the vocal hall that I want. So I'm pulling them both in a parallel form. And just kind of blending the two. Adding a little bit of compression to emphasize it, a little bit of EQ to add my color, and then this is basically just filtering out my S's and adding a little bit more in my low mids that I was just lacking a little bit of. This was something that I added at the very end of my mix because I'm just like, it's not sticking out as much as I want it to, and I'm also running into a little bit of an issue here. But that's really all that I did. With this dark plate, I have it written here. This actually says that this is I believe it's a dark plate and spring. Yeah. So what I'm basically doing is I'm actually doing the same thing with the two halls. I'm sending one to a plate and a copy of it to a spring. Now, it gets really interesting in terms of the tones that I get from that. I'm going to go ahead and isolate this down so that you can hear what the tone is, and I'll go ahead and disable and enable and switch between them. So with this spring, I'm adding a lot of brightness to it. With this plate, it's really dark and low mid present. And so they kind of work hand in hand to get a nice balance over this entire frequency spectrum. Then I pull into compression a little bit more. This is actually sidechain. Excuse me, not compression. This is just a sidechain, ducking it down when the actual send is coming through. And you can see that in action here. And that's just kind of taming it so that it's not overbearing on the entire thing, because without this, it would just be this. And with it goes all of the clarity from that section.
A future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep. Who needs to breathe the air above?
I'm doing a similar thing on my hall, where I'm sidechaining the lead. I'm simply just sending the leads to the hall and my backing to this plate, at least this pre-chorus section. The chorus section's not really getting sent anywhere other than actually just nowhere, I believe. Yeah, it's not getting sent anywhere. And then they're both the lead and this first backing are also getting sent to my delay, which is basically something that you probably heard when playing the entire mix back. It's just adding a little bit more of decay and a little bit more color to the vocal, and it gives it a little bit more dimension and flavor as well, almost. So we'll go ahead and play it. I'll kind of bring in all three of these and then get rid of them, and you can hear what they're doing, each in their own right. So with everything,
Close your eyes, the tide will bring you here with me. We can be so calm, sink into my arms. Hold on tight, you only wanna be with me. On a broken shore, now and evermore.
now I'm just going to give some more emphasis on the vocals.
Close your eyes,
This way you can hear what each element is adding.
close your eyes, the tide will bring you here with me. We can be so calm, sink into my arms. Hold on tight, you only wanna be with me. On a broken shore, now and evermore. I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep. Who needs to breathe the air above when we're both drowning in my love? The tides have turned, don't be afraid. You're not the only soul I've saved. Come to me, come to me. Help me to love you. Come to me, come to me.
So it's adding that tail, it's adding that decay and stuff. All right. But yeah, that basically sums up everything that I'm doing in my mix. Now, while I'm loading up the fresh start session, is there any questions in chat? Anything that is confusing? Anything where I lost you? I'm going to go ahead and pull up the other set right now. I'm also going to get my charger for my laptop so that I can keep talking with you guys. So give me 1 second. And I'm back. All right, so let's go ahead and get into getting a rough mix. So this is a fresh start of this mix. If I go through each of these tracks, you can see I've genuinely got nothing on them at all. So let's go ahead and get into things. The only things that I did not get rid of are my sends, because those took hours to get. And I don't think you guys want to sit with me trying to figure out what tone I'm going for and what direction I want to take it, and I'm just going to kind of fill it in. So let's go ahead and get things going. Let me make sure that these returns are enabled. Let's hear it at how I received it. So this is how I received it. I have everything gained down so that it's not going to blow your guys' ears out. But it might be a little bit loud still. So this is how I received the session.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sail into my life. Take my hand.
I'm just going to stop it there, to be honest, because it's so hard to listen to when it's like this. I could sit here for hours, but doesn't do well for people that maybe don't do this for a living and have to do this every day. So I'm going to go ahead and get rough levels, and before I get into that, I'm going to basically explain what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to enable this little filter right here. Now, this just helps me kind of get good levels really quickly. Basically what this is doing is it's just letting my mid band come through. Anything in between 250 and 2.5 kilohertz. So everything within that band is what I'm going to be able to hear. Anything outside of that, I'm not going to be able to hear anything. And so this is just kind of to make sure that I can get good levels. And that's really all it is. It's something that I've done for many years, and it helps me with my process. It helps me get consistent good levels. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do it, and then I'll play kind of like before I do it, I'm going to play the before, and then after, I'm going to play the after. And it's just going to be faders and panning. That's something I want to make clear right now. I'm simply going to be doing faders and panning. That's what a rough mix kind of defines for me. It's very, very fundamental. It's just panning and fader level. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. Again, this is what it sounds like right now.
Just give in,
why don't I go ahead and get some levels on stuff? So the first thing I'm going to start with is I like to start with my drums and my bass and get my key fundamental stuff, then bring everything else in. So let's go ahead and get things moving, shall we? I want to go ahead and open these up real quick so that I could just swing through and get all my levels. All right. And now you get to follow me on a rough mix. Just gonna back it up now a little bit. now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take a listen to it without the filters and see where I can adjust things. So from listening to it, this should generally be a good placement for my drums, my bass, and I should have good vocal placement as well. I don't know if I touched my lead vocal actually, now that I think about it. It does not look like I did. Let me actually touch my lead vocal real quick before I do that. All right. And now I'm going to go ahead and pull out back the filters, and let's go ahead and take a listen from the top. Let's see how far I'm off.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my light. Take my hand, there's nothing you can say to me. When you hear my voice, then you have no choice. Across my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in.
Okay, so not too far off from a good balance of instruments. I think one thing I do want to emphasize a little bit more are these loops. Put them a little bit more into my left and right rather than my center channel. Another thing that I think I could balance a little bit better are my synths. I can bring these up a little bit more. Bring this pad down a little bit, this one down a little bit, and everything else is kind of pretty solid. So let's go ahead and start doing some rough EQ work on the kick, the bass, the snare, vocals, stuff like that. Just get a general rough blueprint of stuff. So with this, doing the color tone EQ, exactly. Right now I'm just doing my color, my tone, adding a little bit of compression here and there on elements that I know I'm going to add it later, and so I want to try and get a good consistency out of them. Stuff like my kick, my snare, I'm going to do a little bit of compression. This bass is going to do a little bit of compression. The vocals, I'm going to do a little compression. But I'm just going to generally start with. I see you're flipping between solo and entire track. Is it to get context for the sound? Yes, actually. So a lot of people on the internet, if you watch like mixing tutorials, they'll say never EQ in solo, never do this in solo, never compress in solo. The fact of the matter is, sometimes when you're working with like upwards of 60 channels, you gotta solo here and there. But flipping it on so that you can get it, flipping it off so you can hear it in context, and then adjusting it from there. That's kind of what works for me. That's what's worked for other people that I know. And so I generally just say, like, do what works for you, but it's best practice to not just do it in solo, because if I EQ this bass in solo right now, I can get it sounding pretty decent. If I can just play the track, actually, that is. And then just like, yeah, it sounds good, but does it sound good in the context of the song? Not to me. To me, this just sounds really overboding. It's doing a lot in this high end that I don't really see any benefit right now, because there's really no information. So you're just doing this large boost in the high ends to get a little bit more attack out of something when it's not really there in the first place. You got to add it first. And so I'm going to take this EQ back. I'm going to EQ it how I was doing it, where I will flip in and out of solo. To find frequency bands that maybe I can emphasize or maybe not. And so what I'll do is I'll boost a little bit and then flip it back to the entire track and hear where it's lying in the mix. Knowing how I want to process some other things later on, I'm going to actually dip this frequency, but I'm going to make it a little bit more narrow. This one I'm going to keep. So I'm going to just make this a little bit more narrow to where I want it to be, and I'm going to back it to a more reasonable gain amount. There we go. That's sitting pretty nicely. So I am hearing a little bit more of clashing with these loops. So I'm going to make sure that I'm taking out my low end out of all of these. All right, now I'm going to move into the snare. Now, one thing that I will do especially if I'm trying to get a good pairing between my drums and my bass, I will just focus mostly on those. I'll work within the context of each other and then bounce back and forth between the rest of the song. But I'm going to mostly focus on the correlation between the drums and the bass right now. Then I'm going to see how that fits with the rest of the song. Where can I improve? Where can I fix things? What issues am I bringing up to the table? So I'm going to start with making sure I got my kick tone how I want it. Okay. So now I'm hearing like I'm adding a little bit more high ends to this. I'm going to add another EQ. Again, I'm going to emphasize a little bit more on my low end, but I'm also going to emphasize a little bit of my highs. There we go. That sounds pretty good to me. Let's move on to my snare. Now, one thing that I did like from my previous one that I'm just gonna kind of slot in was the thing I did with the reverb. I believe it was in here, yep. I really liked the tone that I got out of this. So I'm gonna I keep that I kept that as a preset only because I don't want to just sit here trying to shape the snare to you know what I want it to sound like. If I'm gonna waste time and maybe bore you guys, I kind of want to get the point across that it doesn't take very long to get a rough mix going to where you want to get a core fundamental and then be able to have room to play around with. One thing I will do right now, though, while I have a second, is I will bring these down a little bit more. Only because I realized that I'm not quite doing it how I normally would. So what I like to do is I like to put a gain stage on my master before it reaches my headphone out. And I like to boost by about like 4, maybe 5 decibels. In this case, I'm going to do 5. And that's so that when I notice that I'm clipping on the meter, I can bring it down. So I can hit like right around like 0 to maybe lightly clipping. And then I'll take it off. And then I basically stepped everything down by 5 steps. So that's just kind of a little trick that I like to do to speed things up a little bit. It works for some people, it doesn't for others. But it generally gets me into a good ballpark for mastering at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and readjust my drums and my bass real quick. You can already hear that just a little bit of processing on my kick, my snare, my bass, and levels and panning. This mix already sounds really good so far. It doesn't take much to get a good sound. It's just knowing when to stop, but also knowing how to get that good sound. Those are really the things that I see people struggle with a lot. Um, it just takes a little bit of time, depending on the person. I pick it up really easily. I've also have a lot of experience too, so um, I can do things relatively quickly, relatively easily, and without much hassle. But for someone that maybe doesn't take as much time with their mixing, or maybe doesn't put so much effort into learning more about it, it could become really difficult. And so I'm really thankful. I want to say this right now. I'm gonna keep going, but I'm really thankful for the AC for inviting me to do this little mixing thing, because genuinely, like, this is something I've been wanting to do for a while. As I think it benefits a lot more people to kind of see how to get rough levels, how to get rough panning, and how to get a rough mix going. Um, but yeah, this works for me. It doesn't work for everybody. But let's go ahead and keep going. I got some synths to work on, I got some guitars to work on, and vocals to get going, and then we'll call it there. You can see my meter is I'm pretty much just barely clipping at this point, so I'm gonna bring down a couple of things here and there. Why is the master on the right turning red? Is it clipping? Yes. So right now what I'm doing with this master, I explained it very briefly, but I didn't really go into depth as to what I'm doing. So because I mix with metal, it generally doesn't bother me. But when I'm doing like in the box mixing, um, which in the box mixing is basically just mixing inside of the DAW without any outboard gear, without any analog hardware, just simply the computer, plugins, stuff like that. That's in the box. When I'm doing my in the box mixing, I like to be able to listen to things at my normal listening level. And so I'll either like put a gain stage like I'm doing right now, or even light limiting, um, just so that I know that I can push my volume without ruining the structure of my mix. So if I was to play this back right now and I turn off my gain stage, you can see where it's landing at on the meters right here. So right now I'm clipping it. Let's go ahead and turn it off. So this is just something that kind of works in my workflow, is to listen a little bit louder, um, but give myself kind of like a safety net of either 4 decibels, 5 decibels, maybe even 6 of gain stage that I can remove at the end and then change my structure there. Like if I really liked the tone of the clipping, I'll go back to an instrument that I really liked the clipping on, and I'll introduce a little bit of clipping on that channel. Whether it be soft clipping, hard clipping, stuff like that, maybe digital, maybe some distortion, whatever the case may be. But in most cases, I'm not focusing on the clipping when I'm doing my in the box mixes. Now, when I'm doing my analog mixes, I have meters everywhere, and so I don't care about that gain stage because in the analog dimension, I'm not running into a digital ceiling on a analog console. There is no digital ceiling. There is a clipping limit, but you have to really drive something in analog to get to a clipping point, especially if you calibrated your stuff to like a standard minus 18 dB FS equals 0 VU. That gives me roughly, I believe it comes out to somewhere between 20 to 24 dB of headroom before I start clipping my console. And so analog, that's why I love working in analog. First off, is because I can push that fucker. Excuse my language, but I can push that fucker to get some really nice gritty tones, really distort it without even clipping the ceiling. And it's amazing in that. And so I kind of just push it up so I can get to my loudness that I'm listening for, balance it, and then I can take this away in the end when I'm ready to master. And it won't be clipping the master. It'll get me in the ballpark of where I want to be for my mix. And it just makes things a little bit easier for me. So the thing about workflow is that it's really all about being able to get results in a short amount of time in the easiest way possible. And for me, that is using a mid-band filter to get my levels. and gain staging to get my loudness. Especially because I can just do this, and now I'm no longer clipping. Exactly, working smarter, not harder. But yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get some rough levels on my vocals. And then I think I'm just gonna call my rough mix there, because that's really where I ended my rough mix. Was, light EQ and compression on the vocals, a little bit of EQ on everything that I need it for, and some basic compression processing on my kick, my snare, and my bass. Now my bass I could push a little bit further, but whatever. I kind of like the tone that I've got right now. And I'm still in that phase, technically, with this rough mix of I'm listening to this song for the first time. I don't know what direction I'm going to take the mix in. I don't know what direction the song is calling for yet. And so I'm going to leave my bass just with a simple EQ to get the tone that I'm looking for out of a bass that works with the mix. From there, I can add a little bit of distortion, a little bit of fuzz, a little bit of multiband compression, depending on what problems or direction that I want to go in. Like if I go in a direction and there's problems that come from that, I can fix that. But right now I can't really decide on that because I'm in the state of mind of I'm just listening to this song the first time. I want to get my rough mix. This is what I deal with most of the time, is getting rough mix. Mostly because, again, I do this for my job. I do this for a living. So I'm not mixing a track that I produced. So I don't have my own production baked into my head. So I'm able to listen to things with a fresh set of ears and an objective mindset as to what is this song calling for? What direction is the song need to go in order to get the best out of this track, in order to get the best emotion out of this track, the best feel out of this track, the best moments out of this track. And so that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm taking that mindset of I'm listening to the song for the first time. I don't know what direction I'm going to take. I did a little bit of direction on this kick and snare only because genuinely, this is where I did my rough mix. Like I had my rough mix and I had some processing on my kick and my snare because I really liked the tone that I picked up, and I'm not going to change it. And I stuck with that. But my bass tone, that was stuff that I added later. My synths, that was stuff that I added later. My acoustic guitars, a lot of that was stuff added later. My electric guitars, that was generally where I ended things. And so we'll go ahead and get into the vocals, and then I think I'm going to call it there. So let's go ahead and get some rough levels on these vocals real quick.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my light. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my light. Take my hand. Just give in, just give in. There's no getting away. Just give in, there's no getting away from me.
Now, one thing I did want to bring up, since I'm kind of just flipping through things, the way that I set a compressor is interesting, at least in how I feel. Depending on what the source is, I'll kind of have a rough idea as to how much gain reduction I want to be able to control things, especially after listening to it on my fader pass. And so I'll generally have a direction of how much gain reduction I need. And so I'll set my threshold and my ratio to a point where I get that gain reduction as minimally as possible. You know, I'll barely kiss that amount of gain reduction that I need. Then a good way to understand what to do after that point, because genuinely speaking, it's going to be a lot quieter.
Just give in, just give in, just give in.
Because the compressor basically is just turning things down past a certain threshold by the ratio that you set. That's how a compressor works. It turns down the signal past a threshold by a given ratio. So anything above this threshold is going to get 7.41 to 1 ratio of gain reduction. It's still going to let things through. It's not a limiter. A limiter would be basically anything above 12 to 1 to all the way to infinity to 1. But generally speaking, with the compression, you want to be able to switch between it and not get any volume dip. Again, you set your fader level, you don't want to really stray from that. And so this is where the makeup gain comes from. Is so you can gain the output of the compressor back up to match the input level in a general rough way. It's not going to be perfect, obviously, because you're containing the dynamics of that input signal within the compressor. But you're matching the amplitude so that you don't need to adjust your fader position. So you don't need to adjust your gain structuring. So if you do it component by component, you don't need to change a lot of stuff. You just go component by component, getting the sounds that you're looking for, fixing the problems that comes from it, and then you don't need to readjust your fader all the time. Because if I just did this, I set my compressor and I really compressed it.
Just give in, there's no getting away.
In order to get the loudness that I want back from it, I would bring up my fader.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me.
And while that works right now, say I want to add a little bit of multiband to it. I need to control my low end. So I'll bring in my multiband and I'll control my lows.
Just give in, there's no getting away.
Or my mids. And I'll do this.
Just give in.
And now it's even quieter again, so I bring it back up. Now my fader is all the way up here when just less than a minute ago, it was down here with my rough mix. And so that's generally why I will kind of go for makeup gain and gain staging all of my components and all of my plugins, making sure that I don't have to touch my fader. Because my fader is what I reach for if something's too loud in a mix, or if something's too quiet. And I need to be able to keep my headroom in order to be able to adjust it upwards or downwards if the mix calls for it. Then you also get into an issue with automating things. It makes it a lot easier to automate the entire level of the vocal if you just got a fader to automate rather than all of these things that you need to change the volume in. But yeah. With that, I'm going to continue getting my vocals levels, just basic processing. I might do a little bit of group processing. But yeah, let's go ahead and keep going.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, selling to my lies. Take my hand, there's nothing you can say to me. When you hear my voice, then you have no choice. I cross my heart, I tell no lies. I see your future in my eyes. I promise you a love so deep. You'll hear me calling in your sleep. Who needs to breathe the air of love? We're both drowning in my love. The tides have turned. Don't be afraid. You're not the only soul I just only soul I close your eyes. The tide will bring you only soul I only soul only soul Close your eyes, the tide will bring you here with me. We can be so calm, sink into my arms. Hold on tight, you only wanna be with me. On a broken
All right, that's pretty decent. Pretty decent. Let's go ahead and start sending some stuff to some reverbs real quick. I'll focus on this section. I'll focus on this section a little bit later. But let's start sending some stuff out. So, reminder: I've got still my drum rooms, my vocal sends. So let's go ahead and start sending some stuff out.
I promise you a There's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my lies. Take my hand, there's nothing you can say to me. When you hear my voice, then you have.
And honestly, I think I'm ready for a quiet test. So, this is another thing that I like to do. And I recommend this to the people that I mentor when it comes to mixing is listen to the track quiet. See what pokes out. See what sticks out. See what's heard. See what's not heard. I'm going to take this gain down by about 20 decibels so that you can really hear the dynamics of the song without it being right up in your ears. So let's go ahead and take a listen. It's going to be a little bit quiet, and that's okay. Let's hear it.
Just give in, there's no getting away from me. Such a perfect night, sailing to my lies. Take my hand, there's nothing you can say to me. When you hear my voice,
I just realized I don't know how long my microphone's been muted. Look at me go. I think I muted my microphone a while ago. So, yeah, big oof. But generally, okay. So I think I'm gonna answer the question that's here. I'm gonna take final questions right now. I'll introduce myself as well during that while people get their questions together. But I really like the direction that this mix is going in, so I'm gonna call it here. To answer your question, M Star, can some of these mixing techniques be applied to Oxy users like the quiet test? Yes, they can. The only one that I don't think you'd really be able to apply is the filters to get your rough mix. But outside of that, I would recommend, turning down your phone or tablet volume to do quiet tests. That way you're not messing around with how Oxy has their audio routed, because it's a very confusing thing to me. I don't quite understand it. But yes, I definitely do think that some of these mixing techniques can be applied to Oxy users, especially if you're an Oxy user that wants to take your music a little bit further and have a little bit more control over it, and maybe you'll be taking it like into FL or Ableton or Logic. These concepts can be applied to any DAW that I went over today. But yeah, I think I'm gonna go ahead and give people a minute to wrap up with some questions. A little bit about myself for those of you that don't know me. I am obviously unprofessional since I had my mic. I'm just kidding. No, my name's Kayden. I've been an audio engineer for about 6 to 7 years at this point. I specialize in recording, mixing, and I do a little bit of mastering here and there. Just joined at the end. Unfortunate. I'm so sorry. Don't worry. It's probably like 30 minutes of me without my mic with my mic muted. So, honestly, yeah. There's that. It's cuz I made it a button on my Stream Deck and I pushed it without thinking. I'm so good at my job. Anyways, but yeah, a little about me. I've been doing this for about 6 to 7 years. I do a little bit of mastering on the side. I'm mostly focused on recording and mixing. I'm electronically trained, but I mostly focus on I mostly work within metal and stuff like that. But yeah, that's a little about me. We'll go ahead and take a listen to the mix that we created, and then we'll compare it to the mix that we started with at the beginning of the stream, my final mix. So this live mix is just like a rough idea, a rough direction, and then the final mix is the one that's a little bit more polished. We'll take a quick listen to some sections from both of them. But if there's any questions in the chat, go ahead and type it in chat. I'll answer them away. I feel so stupid that my microphone has been muted for a while. As you can tell, I'm a professional streamer because I do things with my mic muted. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'll go ahead and answer them. But let's go ahead and take another couple listens to these. Let's take a listen to this rough mix that we created. And then let's go ahead and take a listen to the final mix. So this is basically where I left my rough mix in the actual session, and then I finished it with the final mix. So let's go pull that up. But seeing as there are really no more questions in chats, we'll go ahead and call it here. Thank you guys for sticking around and being so awesome in chat and, you know, asking questions. You guys had really great questions, and I really appreciate that. I know I already thanked the AC community, but I think my mic was probably muted, so I'm going to thank them again anyways. But thank you so much to the AC community for inviting me out here to do this for you guys today. This was a hell of a lot of fun. I would love to do this again if they are interested in doing it again in the future. But let's go ahead and take a listen to the final mix that we started with. So let's go ahead and let's hear the final mastered mix. Let's hear it.